I'm great. Thank you again for
Yeah,
having me.
please. Thank you for coming. Is it your first time doing an Instagram live?
It really is. So
Well,
let's see how this goes.
I'm very proud to know that you're going to be doing it with me. So,
No
welcome
curveballs,
to.
please.
I'll do my best. No promises. But we have a lot to talk about. So usually I give it a few minutes for people to start joining. But in the meantime, I'll do the intro so that those watching can at least hear about you and know who you are, get to know you better. So for the second time this week, I'm super proud to welcome to Infodemia someone from the Atlantic Council. That's Roberta Braga. Bem-vinda.
Thank you, Adrienne.
That's
Thank you for having me.
that's all I can say in Portuguese. That's my Portuñol is very bad. You end up speaking some Portuñol by living in Argentina, but we're not gonna talk about that today.
It's okay.
Um,
We'll forgive you for that one this time.
Thanks. For those of you who do not know Roberta, she is an associate director at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center in Washington, D.C., where she leads projects on Brazil, anti-corruption, disinformation, and misinformation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Excellent. And remember to ask your questions below, and we'll try to answer them at the end if we have some time. Also, if you want to share this later or watch it again, you can find it on my Instagram TV, Facebook, and YouTube pages. So, Roberta, we have a lot to discuss.
Yes.
Like a lot. I don't know if 30 minutes are gonna be enough, because there's so many questions that I have. There are so many topics that I want to cover, and I can imagine that you're super busy these days. Um, Not only we're living in a so-called perfect storm of disinformation and misinformation because of this pandemic, hence the name Infodemic, but also you cover Brazil, right? And many times in the last few weeks, Brazil has been making the headlines for having a president that has been called the leader of the coronavirus denialism movement, right? Um, Not only that, he has even had posts taken down from Facebook and Twitter because they said that they consider them as promotion of misinformation, right? So let's get right to it. How hard is your job right now? How hard is it to tell people that they're reading false or misleading information when it comes from the top of the government? And when everything that you say that is critical of the Bolsonaro administration is always considered to be fake news by him.
So it's always been a little bit difficult to work on this topic in Brazil because Brazil has been for a very long time a very polarized country, more hyper-polarized lately, but sort of dating back to the 2018 elections, we really saw a lot of disinformation that was traveling along polarized lines organically. So there was really no foreign interference as much as just Brazilians who had different views that were very much on the opposite sides of spectrums, really pushing false narratives. And so right now, what we're seeing is that the government has harnessed this narrative of sort of economic prosperity and the need to keep the economy going, and he's pitted against the need to address the health issues. He does this because a lot of his base are workers in Brazil who depend on working outside of the house for their livelihoods. And so
Right.
for them, it's important that that keep going. And so he's really taken the stance of what he calls vertical isolation, which is keeping the most vulnerable in the house while everyone else goes back to normalcy as quickly as possible. So along the lines of that, I think what we've seen from not even necessarily the president himself, but his supporters, is a lot of disinformation that essentially advances, I would say, three goals. It seems to all go along the lines of one, minimizing how serious the disease is, two, discrediting social isolation measures, And three, really, and this part we do see from the president himself, is increasing distrust, and especially distrust in media and
Right.
distrust in health professionals and their guidance.
And
Um,
how is that? So, give us some quick rundown of how that is working out in Brazil. What is the situation right now? Because we can see that the cases are spiking. It doesn't seem to be flattening the curve at all, which is not a surprise. Where is this going? If we saw some rebellion with the governors at one point, but where is this going if we see that the top guy is not interested in the basic guidelines to try to stop the spread of this virus?
So what's interesting with the Brazilian case is that the coronavirus pandemic and all of the reactions to it coming from the government have also been really directly tied to political developments. And so we have at this stage seen a different narrative coming from the federal government than from local government. So
Right.
the governors are really advancing the social isolation approach, the stay home now so you can go back to work much later, but preserving lives is important right now. Whereas at the federal level, especially with Bolsonaro and his three sons, we've seen a lot of the whole that keep the economy going now, like people need to get back to the street and everything like that. So it's really been an interesting take from the top, and it has led to decreased percentages of people staying home. In Brazil right now, in the bigger cities, we're seeing maybe between 50 and 60% of people adhering to social isolation measures,
Hmm.
whereas I think you need about 70% for it to be effective.
Right.
And over the past few weeks, we've also seen a lot of protests. So people are sort of protesting, banging their pots and pans from all over the country. In the biggest cities, you can really hear it. And so those people are sort of protesting against this stance that he's taken and the narratives that he's taken. Whereas online, we're still seeing pro-Bolsonaro supporters advancing these narratives about the disease
Yeah.
not being so bad, nothing being as bad as it is, and that we need to get back to work.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to ask you about. Besides what's coming from the government, how bad is the disinformation situation among people? We knew that disinformation in Brazil was bad enough before, especially with the presidential election. Have you seen a spike in quote unquote fake news or fake audio, like voice messages, fake articles? Are people helping spread this information online much more than they would in the past?
So first, it's important to note that it's kind of difficult to quantify the amount of disinformation, especially in Brazil, because in Brazil, a lot of it circulates through encrypted messaging
Right.
platforms like
So
WhatsApp,
like
where you can't
WhatsApp or
trace.
yeah.
But I would actually say that there's more of an awareness about disinformation, fake news, and its effects now than we saw, for example, around the 2018 elections. That
Uh-huh.
hasn't stopped people from sharing messages without necessarily checking where they come from or trusting their friends and family, and therefore passing on those messages. We haven't seen that stop, but there are a lot more actors involved in the space now, fact checkers, media, and people do have a little bit more of a suspicion for news that they get from these platforms. And people are asking, is this real? Is this not real? But again, that
So
goes
that's
through the
good.
polarized lines. It's
Ah,
good,
okay.
but
Right.
I think the polarization is still contributing to it.
Right. Yeah. But this is something that we were discussing yesterday with Diego, who I can see that just joined. Um, are we once this is over, are we going to be more aware of the problematic of disinformation and fake news? I guess that knowing that people are now more aware, at least maybe fact checking first, is a step in the right direction.
Yes, absolutely. Another interesting thing to note is that at this stage, at least with the pandemic, technology companies have approached this and taken some action to remove fake content. As we saw in the case of President Bolsonaro's posts being removed from Twitter, Facebook, and
Right.
Instagram, whereas they didn't necessarily take that step when it was political disinformation around the 2018 elections. So I think that going forward, and this is something I've talked to my colleague Luisa Bandeira, who also investigates this, is that it might be less acceptable, much less acceptable in the eyes of citizens in Brazil that politicians post incorrect information. They might be held accountable by both the technology companies more than before and by people, the citizens themselves, more than before.
Do you think that, considering that you have this open war between, a large part of the media in Brazil and the Bolsonaro administration, do you feel that there's a crisis of trust when it comes to the media? Um, how do people feel about fact checkers, for example? Because in my case, my family in Spain, it's now very distrustful of fact-checking organizations when they say something that is positive of the current coalition government. Is that happening in Brazil as well?
Yes, so unfortunately, there is a big distrust in traditional media in Brazil. And actually, that distrust has, especially around the pandemic, been thrust against Global News, who is one of the longest standing media outlets in Brazil. There's been a lot of pushback against media for reporting too negatively on COVID or for spreading fake information, which isn't necessarily the case. It's not. But we've seen a lot of that type of narrative coming from the top and from the president himself, much like we saw here in the US with President Trump, where there were a lot of claims that the media was polarizing the environment and the conversation, and that the media were the ones that were making this pandemic seem worse than it is. And I think
Yeah,
that continues, that persists.
yeah. Now, what kind of tools can you provide the population with in order to fact check the information that they have? Because I know that Brazil has several fact checking organizations. What is it that people, besides those organizations, can they do in order to fact check the information that they get on social media?
That's a really good question, and it's something that we've sort of tried to build up over the last 2 years for Brazil specifically. Luckily, I think one of the easiest ways to do it for Brazilians specifically, especially Brazilians having conversations on WhatsApp, is just to make sure they know where that information is coming from and to question their friends and family on it. So audio messages, for example, are very hard to verify. So asking your family member or friend who shared it with you, who shared it with them, and if they know who shared it with that person from before, and then trying to match that information with what's online. And so have other media outlets reported on that particular thing. It's often very easy to identify whether something is, for example, a conspiracy theory, because
Right.
only hyper-partisan outlets will have reported on it. Or you won't have seen any journalists confirming that piece of information. Or they'll already have debunked it. And so if you just type into Google, for example, which is, I know something Diego said yesterday, but it's always relevant, is just go online and type in that information, see what comes up first, and read a few articles before you decide to forward it. And always make sure to watch the video, to read the article. Don't rely only on the title of or the header of that information, because those can be misleading.
Yeah. How do you how do you react, or how do you talk to someone who who's very distrustful of the mainstream media, of fact-checking organizations, and of social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, which there are people who say that they're all some part of a conspiracy in order to silence the truth from certain people. How do you approach people who get their information from fringe elements on YouTube that say that this lab was created by X, or by it's a sort of biological weapon from a country? How do you approach them, and how do you try to explain to them that they should get their information from somewhere else instead of just some guy on YouTube?
So I think the first thing is that no one likes to be called a liar and no one likes to be called stupid.
Right.
So sometimes telling a person you're spreading fake information, stop doing that,
Yeah.
or this is a lie, right? That's not the best way to approach someone who might have some radical views, first of all.
Right.
So I think the better way to do it is to sometimes share other articles from various different sources that might disprove the claim. For YouTube specifically, talking a little bit about the algorithm, so what other videos are out there that might counter this. But also I think it's about having a conversation with people in that person's circle who might be able to help sort of be aware of that and share information with that person as well. Like, here are some other articles you can look at that have other information, or this isn't necessarily what the government is saying. Here's an official website.
Right.
I think that always helps rather than just attacking them or calling them a liar or saying you're doing this on purpose. Sometimes
Right.
that's not the case.
Yeah, empathy is important, right? Like trying to understand where that person comes from and if that person is spreading disinformation, why that person is spreading it.
Oh, absolutely. And oftentimes in Brazil's case, you'll find that it's vinculated a little bit with their political beliefs or who they trust. So the
Right.
community leaders that they trust, and it might be they trust a handful of Congress members, but not the rest. Or they think that the entire government is corrupt, so they get their news from somewhere else. So I think it's a little bit about understanding the why and then
Yeah.
like personalizing that a little bit.
Now, how do you depolarize a society like Brazilian society? And I know that's a very hard question, but I really want to
So,
know.
huh. I will
Can you?
say
First
this
of
is
all,
something
can
that
you?
we're I think, yeah. So yes, you can. I don't, to everyone listening, for Brazilians especially, I recommend that you check out the organization Redes Cordiais. It was founded by journalist Alana Riso, who we've worked with a lot. And this is the focus of her work. So what she's done is she's built a community, brought together really a community of influencers, so not necessarily journalists, but influencers, online influencers, to talk about politics and talk about democracy. And they all have
Yeah.
different views. And what she's found that it is possible to depolarize, and it sometimes only takes putting people in the same room to have a conversation. I think it's much easier online for you to just throw out your views in a more aggressive way or get really
Right.
defensive. But
You
sometimes
end up
it's also
realizing that you have a
one
lot
step
more in
deeper.
common with the other
Yes,
person,
yeah,
right?
exactly. That's exactly it. And she told me that herself, that that's what she found.
Can you give me an example of some really crazy story or fake story or a voice message that you've come across that you were like, wow, this is insanely uh, or ridiculously false, but at the same time, it's very creative because I feel that unfortunately they're getting whoever is creating those pieces of information, they're getting savvier, right? They're getting more
Yeah.
sophisticated. Um, so it's really hard to disprove that to people that you talk to. So what can you give us some examples of something that you've come across that you're like mind blown by it?
I mean, they're not even that, I don't think they're that surprising. So a couple, I'll say two. One is a conspiracy theory around why former Minister of Justice Sergio Moro quit, and it was a claim that he had been in conspiracy to overthrow the Bolsonaro government and that he had been in cahoots with the former head of the federal police, Valeixo, to take down the government. So we've seen a lot of this whole, they're all here to take down Bolsonaro and take down the government. Another one has been that China created this virus in a lab to destabilize the economy and ruin
Yeah.
Brazilian companies and competitiveness.
Wow. So
It
it
always
was
seems to
targeting
be,
Brazil.
yeah, it always seems
Wow.
to be sort of government versus the other. That's sort of the nature of the conspiracy theories. There's always an us versus them.
Right. Wow. That's crazy. It's how is Brazilian society, or how does Brazilian society behave towards conspiracy theories? Because here in Argentina, people love them. Conspiracy theories here thrive, from the moon landing to 9/11. So, how are people in Brazil regarding conspiracy theories? Are they open to them, or are they more like mm, reluctant to believe them?
Uh, it's hard to make a generalized claim about this. And in Brazil's context, I think what you believe is again tied closely to polarization and your
Mm,
political beliefs. Um, I think it's always a little bit compelling to believe a big header like some conspiracy theories out there than to believe an unfortunate reality, especially right
right.
now with the crisis.
Yeah.
But I would say, I mean, the majority of Brazilians are not spreading conspiracies. I think that where we see the conspiracy spreading right now, particularly, is Bolsonaro supporters of the government who identify with his narrative that this pandemic isn't as bad as it should be, or isn't as bad as it is, and they've clung to the conspiracies because it justifies that. It justifies that this will blow over very quickly, or it's not as bad as people say, and they're just trying to keep us down. So I think that we've seen a lot of that. It's not just
Right.
alien to one side or the other, I will say that. It's, of course, a very hyper-polarized effect,
Right.
but right
Right.
now, the biggest conspiracies that we've seen spreading around the pandemic have been by large groups of Bolsonaro supporters who are trying to sort of justify and cling to this isn't as bad as it should be, and it'll be over soon.
Right. Can you think of any any case where a mainstream media outlet has been promoting an outlandish conspiracy theory? For example, is there any media outlet in Brazil saying this was created in a lab to destroy us? Or is that just coming from, you know, bad actors, unidentified bad actors?
It tends to come actually mostly from hyperpolarized outlets. So I won't call them independent media outlets or media outlets, but hyperpolarized blogs, hyperpolarized
Hmm.
sites, social media accounts, uh, specific social media accounts or groups of social media accounts that identify with one side or the other. I haven't seen any prominent media outlet spreading conspiracies in Brazil. Um, I haven't seen it, but that doesn't. I don't know if there are any big names out there. But in Brazil's case, no. Like the media is still very much independent, and they're reporting on this in a fact based way. And where we might see some misleading information is mostly from those hyperpolarized blogs.
Do you think that this pandemic and the situation, the way that he's handled the outbreak in Brazil, is this putting Bolsonaro's presidency in danger?
I think it's affecting his support. So Bolsonaro, when Sergio Moro came into office as Minister of Justice, he came into office as sort of the figurehead of the anti-corruption movement, for example. And so he was someone that Bolsonaro supporters revered, and he was someone that would advance the cause to fight what was considered a former corrupt government.
Right.
So now with this political crisis matched with the pandemic, we've seen Bolsonaro's online support go down. And especially after Moro's resignation, there are a lot of people that are upset with Bolsonaro that see this as a sort of a betrayal or a signal that he's not committed to the promises that he made during the campaign.
Hmm. So, how could this translate politically?
So I don't see. Some people say politically that the government has lost a lot of clout, that he won't be able to govern.
Hmm.
That may be true. I think we'll have to see how this develops and whether he's able to get support and redefine his narrative to get support elsewhere. But there's also, and again, this isn't as much related to disinformation as it is related to both politics and disinformation. There are ongoing investigations into his three sons. And
Uh-huh.
depending on what they find, there's especially one investigation that's focused on what they called the cabinet of hatred, that is supposedly Carlos Bolsonaro and Eduardo Bolsonaro at the head of advancing disinformation online. There's nothing that's
Right.
been proven yet. It's ongoing. But if that
There was a
comes
big
to
story
light,
recently, right,
mhm,
on his son who was part of this sort of fake news operation, trying to push disinformation out there.
it is an ongoing investigation. So there are no confirmed links yet, but I think that if his three sons are implicated in this, that'll be really telling again for his presidency, and we'll have to see whether he continues supporting them, or whether he changes his positions on this.
It's hard, isn't it? Like you have a lot of work.
I don't
um,
think this problem is going away anytime soon.
no, no, and I know it's impressive because I know that you do not just focus on Brazil, right? But there is so much going on that it almost feels like it's sucking all the air in the room. Brazil really needs a lot of, or is taking a lot of attention right now because of what's happening, not just because of the pandemic, but also the flourishing of fake news and disinformation. So I really appreciate the fact that you took some time to be with us today. I think this is a fascinating topic. There are so many things that we can talk about, and I'm really happy that you are here today so that you can explain people who have no idea of what's going on out there. Uh, what is happening behind the scenes, and why disinformation and the rise of fake news is so important to understand because of the potential that it has of changing our lives or affecting our lives. So thank you so much for being here, Roberta, and thanks everyone who joined. Today was in English, which I know that a lot of people were complaining about, but you got to practice sometimes, right? So
Next
tomorrow
time I'll have to try my hand at my Spanish then.
I promise I'll try. We can do Portuñol and maybe we can understand each other. And I'm sure that people are going to be very happy. But tomorrow we're switching back to Spanish. We have Laura Garcia from First Draft, and we'll be discussing disinformation in the UK and Mexico. And remember that if you want to watch or share this again, you can check it on my Instagram TV, Facebook, and YouTube pages. Okay, so thank you, Roberta, for doing this. It's been a pleasure. I hope to have you again in the future when we know more about what's happening in Brazil. And everyone else, thank you for joining. We'll see each other tomorrow. Okay,
Thank you so much.
thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.